In 1166, the Gaelic Ireland underwent a structural collapse when Diarmait mac Murchada, the hereditary king of Leinster, was forcibly deposed and driven into exile. This was not a mere local skirmish, but a coordinated coup led by Tigernan Ua Ruarc and the High King Ruaidrí Ua Conchobair, resulting in the total forfeiture of mac Murchada's ancestral lands. Under the Brehon legal system, kingship was inextricably tied to the possession of territory and the ability to maintain a retinue, yet Diarmait's wealth was primarily stored in cattle and land rights, rather than mobile bullion. As he fled across the Irish Sea, he embodied the ultimate distressed asset, an individual possessing a legitimate, high-value, sovereign claim, but lacking the liquid capital required to mobilize a professional military response. The Gaelic economy functioned on a system of tribute and kinship, which provided zero institutional mechanisms for funding a counter-invasion from abroad. Mac Murchada realized that reclaiming in his kingdom necessitated a transition into the Anglo-Norman financial sphere, where war was increasingly a commercial enterprise requiring professional mercenaries, armored cavalry, and naval logistics. His primary objective in seeking an audience with Henry II was to secure the legal permit known as a licentia, which would allow him to bypass traditional feudal restrictions and seek private financing. By the time he reached the ports of Bristol, Diarmait was no longer just a king in exile. He was a strategic opportunity for financiers looking to expand into the untapped Irish frontier. He arrived in England with a desperate need for specie to pay for the ironclad technology of the Norman knights, a commodity that was virtually non-existent in his own kingdom. This financial vacuum set the stage for a high-risk partnership between a dispossessed monarch and the sophisticated credit networks of the Anglo-Jewish community. In late 1166, Diarmait mac Murchada tracked the itinerant court of Henry II to the Duchy of Aquitaine, initiating a diplomatic engagement that would fundamentally alter the legal status of the Irish frontier. Mac Murchada's objective was to secure a formal acknowledgement of his status as a vassal, thereby integrating his territorial ambitions into the Angevin administrative framework. Henry II, embroiled in complex continental disputes and the burgeoning conflict with Thomas Becket, was unwilling to commit royal troops or state resources to a peripheral Irish campaign. However, he recognized the utility of allowing his more restive and undercapitalized border lords to seek fortunes elsewhere. Consequently, Henry issued a royal licentia, a critical administrative document that granted mac Murchada the king's peace and authorized him to recruit military agents from across the Angevin domains. This permit was not a mere gesture of safe conduct. It was a powerful legal instrument that legitimized the private enterprise of war, essentially deregulating the recruitment of knights and archers. It provided the necessary political cover for marcher lords like Richard de Clare, whose estates in Wales were under heavy fiscal pressure and whose standing with the crown was precarious. By holding the licentia, Mac Murchada transformed from a fugitive into a high-status solicitor of professional military services. This document was the essential precursor to any financial arrangement, as no reputable financier would advance capital to an unsanctioned military venture. The licentia effectively served as a royal letter of credit, signaling to the merchant communities of Bristol and the Angevin ports that the proposed expedition was a state-sanctioned project. This legal framework allowed for the drafting of formal contracts between mac Murchada and his Norman recruits, shifting the conflict from a tribal feud to a regulated, cross-channel commercial operation. The focus of the invasion moved to the port of Bristol, which functioned as the primary administrative and logistics hub for the Irish Sea. By 1167, this city housed a well-established Jewish community that operated as the essential source of mobile wealth in a regional economy, otherwise dominated by illiquid feudal estates. While the Norman marcher lords possessed vast landholdings in Wales, these assets could not be instantly converted into the silver bullion required to equip a professional expeditionary force. The Jewish community in Bristol, positioned outside the traditional manorial system, maintained the only significant reserves of liquid specie and international credit networks capable of bridging this capital gap. They provided the essential seed funding that transformed a collection of indebted knights into a professionalized military operation. This financial intervention enabled the procurement of specialized equipment, the chartering of merchant vessels, and the mass purchase of victuals necessary for a cross-channel deployment. The financiers operated within a high-risk credit environment, advancing funds to individuals like Robert Fitzstephen and Strongbow, whose primary collateral was the speculative promise of future Irish land grants. These transactions were meticulously recorded and monitored through the local communal infrastructure, ensuring that the movement of iron, horses, and men was underpinned by a rigorous accounting of debt. The Bristol community effectively underwrote the logistics of the invasion, recognizing that the territorial expansion into Ireland offered a new frontier for debt management and resource extraction. Without this concentration of urban capital, the mobilization of the professional ironclad units would have been delayed by the slow mechanisms of feudal assembly. Consequently, the Jewish quarters of Bristol became the definitive counting houses for the conquest, where the transition from military planning to active deployment was finalized through the provision of direct, short-term credit. The financing of the Irish invasion was fundamentally predicated on a rigid theological prohibition that inadvertently granted the Jewish community a structural monopoly on credit. During the late 12th century, the Catholic Church aggressively enforced the doctrine of usury, which categorized the lending of money for interest as a mortal sin for Christians. This ban was not merely religious but legal, as ecclesiastical courts possessed the authority to excommunicate lenders and invalidate their property rights. Consequently, the native Anglo-Norman population was restricted to primitive forms of finance, such as land-based bartering or non-interest-bearing familial loans, which were entirely insufficient for funding trans-channel expeditions. This prohibition created a profound commercial vacuum in the burgeoning political economy of the Angevin Empire. Jewish financiers, residing outside the jurisdiction of the canon law, were the only legal entities capable of providing interest-bearing capital. This unique legal status transformed them into the sole viable source of funding for distressed or speculative ventures like the Irish campaign. Because the risks of the invasion were astronomical, including shipwrecks, military defeat, and the uncertain value of Gaelic territory, no lender would provide silver without the incentive of high-interest returns to offset potential total loss. The Church's stance effectively outsourced the high-risk financial architecture of the state to this non-feudal minority. By 1168, the credit operations of the Jewish community had become a vital, if controversial, pillar of state expansion. They functioned as the offshore bank of the medieval world, providing the liquidity that Christian barons could neither legally generate nor ethically offer. This usury vacuum ensured that every major military investment in the Irish frontier passed through Jewish counting houses, linking the theological boundaries of Christendom to the expansionist ambitions of the Norman state. By the late 1160s, the center of gravity for the Irish expedition shifted toward Gloucester, driven by the strategic vision of Jossi of Gloucester, a preeminent financier with a profound understanding of aristocratic insolvency. Jossi recognized that the marcher lords of the Welsh borders were fundamentally over-leveraged. Their wealth was locked in stagnant land assets, while they faced escalating costs from border skirmishes and royal taxes. Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, was the primary representative of this distressed nobility, holding a title but lacking the liquid capital to maintain his social or military standing. Joss viewed the invasion of Ireland not as a crusade, but as a leveraged buyout of an entire territory. He calculated that by providing the immediate silver necessary to mobilize Strongbow's retinue, he could secure a claim against the massive potential revenues of a new Irish colony. This was a sophisticated exercise in debt restructuring. Joss advanced thousands of pounds in bullion, enabling the Normans to pivot from their failing Welsh estates toward the acquisition of high-yield Irish manors. This capital injection allowed the Marcher lords to settle their immediate domestic liabilities while preparing for a campaign that would, if successful, provide the assets needed to retire their debts entirely. Jossi's operation was so extensive that it drew the direct scrutiny of the royal administration, as he was effectively financing an independent military venture that challenged the king's monopoly on force. His role was catalytic. He provided the bridge between the old feudal economy and a new credit-driven expansionism. By backing Strongbow, Jossi wasn't just lending money. He was underwriting the transformation of bankrupt barons into the new sovereign elite of Ireland. His counting house in Gloucester served as the operational headquarters for the capital flows that made the ironclad invasion a fiscal reality. The logistical mobilization for the 1169 invasion was underpinned by a sophisticated legal technology known as the bipartite indenture. As Jewish financiers advanced massive quantities of silver for the procurement of specialized military hardware, they required a verifiable and tamper-proof method to record these high-stakes obligations. The indenture was a single parchment containing two identical copies of the loan terms, which was then cut in half along an irregular serpentine line. The creditor retained one portion while the debtor held the matching counterfoil, ensuring that the contract could only be validated when the two jagged edges were physically reunited. This mechanism provided an essential layer of security in an era of volatile legal claims and nomadic military retinues. These documents recorded specific advances for the ironclad infrastructure of the campaign: the high-carbon steel required for chainmail hauberks, the importation of heavy destriers from the continent, and the chartering of transport vessels from the Bristol merchant fleet. Unlike traditional feudal tallages, these were professional credit arrangements where the loan was secured against the future productivity of the Irish frontier. The indentures acted as a portable archive of the realm's indebtedness, allowing financiers to track the capital flows into the invasion with bureaucratic precision. When a knight defaulted or fell in battle, the matching portion of the indenture held by the financier served as the definitive legal proof required to claim the underlying collateral, which often consisted of land rents or seized bullion. This systematic record-keeping transformed the chaos of medieval warfare into an audited commercial enterprise. By utilizing these instruments, the creditors in Gloucester and Bristol effectively monetized the professionalization of the Norman military machine, ensuring that the movement of every horse and every link of mail was documented, guaranteed, and recoverable under the king's law. The economic reality of 1169 was defined by a massive disparity between the seasonal, landlocked wealth of the feudal nobility and the immediate, silver-denominated costs of professional warfare. Iron was the strategic high technology of the 12th century, and its procurement represented a prohibitive barrier to entry for the Norman baronage. The manufacturing of a single chainmail hauberk required thousands of hand-riveted links of high-carbon steel, a process involving specialized guildsmen whose labor was concentrated in urban centers, far from the rural manors of the Marcher lords. A knight's full equipment, comprising the hauberk, helmet, shield, and sword, frequently cost more than the annual surplus of a productive village. Furthermore, the ironclad advantage depended on the destrier, a heavy warhorse bred specifically for shock cavalry tactics. These animals were significantly more expensive than agricultural workhorses, requiring specialized diets and continuous maintenance by professional farriers and grooms. The Norman barons, while possessing vast territorial holdings, operated within a primitive agrarian economy that generated wealth in the form of grain, livestock, and wool. These commodities could not be liquidated rapidly enough to meet the upfront demands of armories or the cash wages required by professional fletchers and engineers. This fundamental liquidity gap meant that the physical instruments of conquest were beyond the internal financing capacity of the feudal estates. The move to Ireland was thus delayed not by a lack of military intent, but by the physical impossibility of mobilizing the necessary metallurgical and biological assets without an external infusion of specie. The cost of iron effectively transformed the invasion from a traditional feudal muster into an industrial-scale operation that necessitated the intervention of urban capital markets to bridge the divide between manorial wealth and military hardware. The military career of Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow, was fundamentally a strategic rebellion against the rigid hierarchy of the Angevin court. By 1170, Strongbow existed in a state of legal and fiscal limbo. Although he held the title of Earl of Strigul, his failure to secure royal confirmation of his father's earldom of Pembroke had stripped him of essential feudal revenues. Facing the permanent erosion of his status, he chose to utilize external credit to bypass the traditional constraints of the feudal pyramid, which restricted a lord's expansion to the lands granted by his sovereign. This Strongbow gamble was an attempt to establish an independent primary tenancy in Ireland, effectively creating a new sovereign state outside the immediate reach of the English Exchequer. The financing for this venture was an unprecedented move in risk concentration, as de Clare borrowed against the totality of his remaining Welsh and English assets to field a force of approximately 200 knights and 1,000 archers. This was not a standard feudal levy, but a private military enterprise where every participant was a professional shareholder in a territorial venture. The reliance on liquid capital allowed Strongbow to maintain a standing force through the winter months, a capability that Gaelic kings, who relied on seasonal tribal mobilizations, could not match. By securing the hand of Eowulf of Leinster, Strongbow successfully merged Norman military contract law with Gaelic succession customs, positioning himself as the heir to an entire kingdom. This transition from a land-poor marcher lord to a prospective Irish monarch was made possible only by the continuous infusion of specie from creditors who accepted the high-risk bet on his survival. Consequently, the conquest was less a royal expansion than a private leveraged buyout of the Leinster crown, threatening to establish a rival Norman power center across the Irish Sea. In May 1169, the theoretical financial planning of the Bristol and Gloucester counting houses transitioned into a tactical reality at Bannow Bay, Wexford. This initial landing represented a startup military force, a vanguard designed to secure a beachhead rather than achieve immediate total conquest. The contingent consisted of approximately 30 knights, 60 men-at-arms, and 300 Welsh archers, led by Robert Fitzstephen. This specific force composition was a direct result of the seed capital provided by English financiers, which prioritized the high-yield impact of ironclad cavalry and the long-range lethality of the Welsh longbow. Unlike the tribal levies of the High King, this was a salaried, professional unit capable of sustained operations beyond the traditional harvest season campaign window. The landing craft and supplies were financed through short-term credit arrangements, ensuring that the troops were fully provisioned independently of local foraging. The military conflict opened not with a grand battle, but with a disciplined march on the Norse Gaelic town of Wexford. Here, the professionalization of the force was immediately evident. The Normans utilized advanced siege tactics and coordinated missile fire that the town's defenders, accustomed to traditional Gaelic warfare, were unable to effectively counter. The success of this first wave was essential to the lenders, as it established the first physical assets in Ireland, townships and harbors, that could be leveraged for further credit expansion. This tactical foothold proved the viability of the Irish venture to the broader Norman aristocracy, signaling that the speculative investment in MacMurchada's restoration was generating tangible territorial returns. By securing Bannow Bay, the Normans established a permanent maritime logistics corridor, allowing for the continuous flow of reinforcements and material funded by the ongoing credit lines from the Anglo-Jewish community. The Siege of Wexford in 1169 marked a pivotal transition in the Irish campaign, shifting from a mobile vanguard operation to a resource-intensive war of attrition that required sustained financial underwriting. As the Norse Gaelic defenders of the town burned their own suburbs and retreated behind their stone fortifications, the Norman forces were forced to implement a high-cost engineering blockade. This phase of the conflict necessitated a continuous supply line of specialized tools, timber for assault towers, and high-tensile ropes for scaling, all of which had to be imported from Bristol and financed through ongoing credit facilities. The Jewish creditors in Gloucester and Bristol were essentially providing the working capital for this engineering effort, recognizing that the town's surrender was the only path to a return on their initial investment. For the financiers, the siege represented a period of peak risk, as the daily wages for professional archers and fletchers accrued interest, while the primary collateral, the town's bullion and port revenues, remained locked behind defensive walls. The technical superiority of the Normans, funded by this urban capital, eventually broke the defenders' resolve. Following a failed assault, the town's clergy brokered a surrender to prevent total destruction. The immediate aftermath was a decisive financial event. MacMurchudda granted the town of Wexford and its surrounding territories to Robert Fitzstephen and Maurice Fitzgerald as joint tenants. This act formalized the conversion of military conquest into a quantifiable land asset that could be registered in the creditor's indentures. The acquisition of Wexford provided the first stable, urban revenue stream of the conquest, allowing the Norman lords to begin servicing their debts and signaling to English capital markets that the speculative Irish frontier was now a high-performing investment. As the Norman foothold in Ireland expanded, the primary logistical challenge shifted from initial equipment to the continuous maintenance of a silver-denominated military economy. Gaelic Ireland operated largely through a system of barter and cattle wealth, possessing no indigenous mints and a critical scarcity of circulating coinage. To prevent the collapse of the ironclad professional force, which required cash wages rather than agricultural tribute, the Jewish financiers in Bristol and London functioned as the essential valves for the bullion trade. They utilized their facility with international exchange to ensure a steady flow of unminted silver and foreign specie across the Irish Sea. This was a sophisticated operation involving the conversion of bulky manorial surpluses from England into portable, high-value bullion that could be shipped securely to the new administrative hubs in Wexford and Waterford. The financiers acted as high-level assayers and money changers, standardizing the various weights and purities of silver circulating in the Atlantic trade. This expertise was vital because the invasion force comprised mercenaries from across the Angevin Empire who demanded payment in reliable currency. By managing the bullion trade, the creditors effectively monetized the conquest, allowing the Norman lords to pay for reinforcements, maritime transport, and specialized fletchers in a land where silver was a rare strategic asset. These transactions were underpinned by the transnational familial networks of the financiers, which allowed for the movement of credit without the physical transport of heavy metal in every instance. The bullion trade functioned as the circulatory system of the invasion, ensuring that as soon as ground was taken, it was immediately integrated into a broader European financial network. This continuous supply of silver prevented the Norman knights from being absorbed into the primitive Gaelic barter system, maintaining their status as a professional, salaried elite capable of sustained military pressure. The storming of Waterford in August 1170 transformed the speculative venture of the Irish invasion into a concrete financial success, providing the first large-scale liquidation of Norse Gaelic assets. The tactical breach of Reginald's Tower by Strongbow's reinforced units led to the immediate seizure of the city's concentrated mobile wealth, which had been accumulated through generations of Viking-age maritime commerce. Unlike the rural agrarian surplus of the interior, Waterford contained significant quantities of silver bullion, high-value ecclesiastical ornaments, and commercial inventories of wine and textiles. This portable wealth served as the primary mechanism for the first return on investment for the financiers in Bristol and Gloucester. The processing of these spoils was not a chaotic looting, but a systematic administrative recovery. The seized bullion was inventoried and channeled through the transnational familial networks of the Jewish creditors to ensure the security of the transmission. By utilizing these established banking corridors, the Norman leadership could instantly credit their accounts in England, effectively retiring a portion of the high-interest principal accrued during the long winter of 1169. The capture of this port city also provided the first stable maritime customs infrastructure, allowing financiers to begin leveraging future trade duties as collateral for the next phase of the campaign. Waterford's integration into the Norman fiscal sphere signaled that the Irish Sea was no longer a barrier to resource extraction, but a corridor for the rapid movement of capital. This event verified the profitability of the Strongbow gamble to the broader Angevin financial elite, proving that professional military force could successfully unlock the dormant silver reserves of the Norse Gaelic townships. The fall of the city thus acted as a definitive proof of concept for the creditors, ensuring the continued availability of credit for the upcoming march on Dublin. In August 1170, the tactical acquisition of Waterford was immediately finalized by a legal ceremony that consolidated the Norman military gains into a durable financial estate. The marriage of Richard de Clare to Aoife, daughter of Diarmait mac Murchada, functioned as a strategic merger designed to resolve the high volatility risk associated with the invasion's initial land claims. By securing this alliance, Strongbow utilized dynastic mechanics to transform his status from an occupying commander into a primary tenant, providing his creditors with a localized administrative anchor. For the Jewish financiers in Bristol and Gloucester, this merger represented a critical milestone in collateral stabilization. Prior to the ceremony, the outstanding loans were secured against speculative assets, territory held solely by tactical force. The marriage converted these fluid military gains into a codified, hereditary asset base. This transition provided the institutional framework necessary for the long-term extraction of agricultural surplus and urban census taxes, allowing creditors to begin the process of debt restructuring. The financiers shifted their perspective from funding high-risk war bonds to managing capital investments underpinned by a functioning administrative state. The union of Norman military might and Gaelic lineage provided the permanence required to attract subsequent tranches of capital for the mobilization against Dublin. Lenders recognized that a king consort possessed a significantly higher credit rating than a mercenary leader, as his authority to levy future duties was now validated by marriage law. This strategic consolidation ensured that the recovery of debt through an evolving court system became statistically more predictable. Ultimately, the marriage provided the definitive exit strategy for early-stage financiers, transforming the Irish Sea venture from a raiding operation into a permanent, revenue-generating entity within the broader Angevin financial sphere. In September 1170, the military seizure of Dublin marked the transition of the Irish venture from a territorial campaign to the acquisition of a mature commercial infrastructure. As the primary maritime hub of the Norse Gaelic world, Dublin possessed a pre-existing economic framework that enabled the immediate commencement of large-scale financial operations. For the creditors in Bristol and London, the capture provided a safe haven where liquid assets could be managed under the standardized protections of Norman administrative law, effectively bypassing the unpredictable and arbitrary imposts characteristic of Gaelic tribal jurisdictions. These localized Gaelic tributes, often based on hospitality or kinship demands, were replaced by a transparent system of urban census and customs duties. The city's established quays and warehouses allowed financiers to implement sophisticated bullion handling and money-changing facilities on site, facilitating the conversion of Irish loot into portable European credit. By securing this urban enclave, the Norman leadership provided their lenders with a predictable revenue-generating node that functioned independently of the volatile interior. The capture of Dublin allowed for the first institutionalized clearinghouse for the invasion's mounting debts, where the unminted silver of the Ostmen was assayed and credited against the bipartite indentures held in Gloucester. This urban stronghold served as the administrative pivot point, ensuring that the movement of specie and goods was regulated by the same legal protections afforded to the king's subjects in England. Dublin's status as a royal borough solidified its role as a colonial financial centre, underwriting the subsequent expansion of the Angevin state and providing the creditors with a guaranteed mechanism for resource extraction that was shielded from the jurisdictional chaos of the surrounding Gaelic lordships. This consolidation turned Dublin into the definitive operational base for the transnational credit networks that sustained the Norman presence. By early 1171, the rapid territorial gains and independent administrative consolidation of Richard de Clare triggered a decisive sovereign intervention by Henry II. The king interpreted the establishment of a Norman Gaelic power centre in Dublin as a direct threat to the Angevin monopoly on authority and a potential loss of fiscal oversight. To neutralize this rival state before it achieved total self-sufficiency, Henry implemented a strategic embargo forbidding any vessel from English or Welsh ports to transport provisions, reinforcements, or military equipment to Ireland. This executive decree was designed to induce a supply-side collapse of the professional invasion force, which remained entirely dependent on a cross-channel logistics bridge for specialized hardware and salaried men. By cutting these essential arteries, the Crown effectively froze the assets of the Marcher Lords, rendering their Irish land claims illiquid and militarily unsustainable. This administrative isolation introduced a catastrophic level of sovereign risk for the Jewish financiers in Bristol and Gloucester, whose indentures were now secured against a venture that the king had declared legally and physically isolated. The embargo functioned as a form of fiscal warfare, pressuring Strongbow to choose between total bankruptcy or the unconditional surrender of his Irish acquisitions to the royal treasury. Henry's objective was to ensure that the Irish Sea did not become a corridor for autonomous aristocratic expansion, but rather a supervised branch of the royal administrative system. This period of enforced stagnation forced the Norman leadership into a desperate diplomatic capitulation, acknowledging that no amount of private capital could withstand the total withdrawal of the king's peace and the subsequent closure of the state-controlled ports. These measures demonstrated that the ultimate guarantor of any trans-channel investment remained the physical and legal control of the English maritime infrastructure. Henry II's transition from passive embargo to direct military intervention in 1171 required a volume of liquid specie that traditional feudal aids could not provide. To mobilize an armada of 400 ships and a professional force of 500 knights and 4,000 men-at-arms, the king bypassed the protracted negotiations of the Great Council and utilized his primary fiscal instrument, the tallage. Under the legal principle of servi cameri regis, the Jewish community functioned as a central bank for the monarchy, where assets were perpetually accessible to the royal chamber. This was not a voluntary credit arrangement, but a non-interest-bearing extraction, effectively treating the total liquid wealth of the Anglo-Jewish community as a state-run capital reserve. The pipe rolls of 1171 document the systematic conversion of these tallages into the logistical architecture of the royal fleet. Massive sums were allocated for the mass procurement of victuals at Milford Haven, including thousands of carcasses of salted pork, extensive stores of wheat, and imported wine to sustain the army during the occupation. Furthermore, this capital financed the chartering of heavy merchant vessels and the wages of professional mariners and fletchers, resources that were strictly denominated in silver. By utilizing this concentrated urban wealth, Henry II ensured his expeditionary force was decoupled from the slow and unreliable feudal muster. This financial maneuver allowed the Crown to nationalize the Irish frontier, shifting the conflict from a private venture to a centralized state operation. The royal fleet stood as the material manifestation of this fiscal supremacy, built on the immediate availability of specie that only the king's personal servants could provide. This administrative mobilization ensured that when the king landed in Waterford, his presence was underpinned by the absolute logistical dominance of the Angevin state. The implementation of the legal doctrine servi cameri regis, servants of the king's chamber, provided the foundational jurisdiction for Henry II's administrative control of the Irish frontier. This status established a profound legal singularity, effectively removing the Jewish community from the common law and the traditional feudal hierarchy that governed the rest of the Angevin realm. By designating financiers as the personal property of the crown, the king bypassed the authority of local sheriffs, powerful marcher lords, and ecclesiastical courts who frequently sought to interfere in debt collection or jurisdictional oversight. This extra-feudal status meant that any wrong committed against a member of the community was treated as a direct trespass against the king's own treasury, necessitating immediate sovereign intervention. For the monarchy, the primary motive was the creation of a fiscal reservoir that could be tapped without the consent of the Great Council. For the financiers, the benefit was a high-status legal sanctuary that shielded their mobile wealth from arbitrary seizures by the debt-burdened nobility. In the context of the 1171 invasion, this status allowed Henry II to nationalize the liabilities of the marcher lords. Since the creditors were servants of the chamber, the debts they held over individuals like Strongbow were classified as state assets. The royal protection of these financiers allowed them to act as essential paymasters during the occupation, managing the distribution of silver wages for the 500 knights and 4,000 professional troops under Henry's direct command. This legal architecture ensured that the transition of Ireland into a royal lordship was underpinned by the absolute oversight of the king's financial agents. Consequently, the Jewish community's existence became a permanent extension of the sovereign prerogative, a specialized cohort whose legal survival was inextricably linked to the fiscal health of the royal treasury. In October 1171, the administrative power of the Angevin state achieved its maximum expression as Henry II disembarked at Waterford with a fleet of 400 vessels. This was not a desperate gamble for land, but a meticulously executed state maneuver, funded by the unprecedented extraction of liquid capital from the Jewish financiers of England. The expeditionary force, consisting of 500 knights and 4,000 professional infantry, functioned as a salaried extension of the royal household, possessing a logistical continuity that the earlier private ventures fundamentally lacked. Upon landing, the king established immediate administrative control over the Norse Gaelic ports, treating the conquest as an audited expansion of the royal domain rather than a feudal acquisition. The arrival of the fleet signaled the end of Strongbow's period of autonomous rule, as the king utilized his superior funding to nationalize the logistics of the frontier. The massive supplies of salted pork, grain, and wine procured through the royal chamber's credit ensured that the army remained independent of the Gaelic agrarian economy, allowing Henry to maintain a presence through the winter of 1171 without the need for traditional foraging. This landing converted the Irish conflict into a standardized province of the Angevin Empire, where the submission of Gaelic kings was secured through the sheer scale of the state's industrial-scale supply lines. The presence of the king's officials, alongside the ironclad cavalry, facilitated the immediate implementation of royal fiscal oversight in Dublin and Wexford. By establishing a permanent royal lordship, Henry ensured that the territorial gains of the previous 2 years were codified and integrated into the broader tax-paying infrastructure of the crown. The 1171 expedition demonstrated that the professionalization of the Norman military machine reached its zenith when backed by the total liquid reserves of the state's financial agents. Between the winter of 1171 and the spring of 1172, the military occupation of Ireland transitioned into a formal administrative lordship as the primary Gaelic kings, including the rulers of Desmond, Thomond, and Breifne, performed rituals of homage and fealty to Henry II at Dublin. This was a definitive legal event that translated fluid tribal territories into a codified feudal topography, integrating the Irish interior into the Angevin jurisdictional sphere. For the creditors who had underwritten the initial phases of the invasion, these submissions represented the ultimate exit strategy for their speculative capital. The territory was no longer a high-volatility war zone, but a standardized administrative entity where property rights were now guaranteed by the centralized protection of the Crown. This integration allowed the financiers to transition from managing private booty claims to overseeing sovereign revenue streams. The submission of the Gaelic elite ensured that the unminted silver and agricultural surpluses of the Irish lordships could now be systematically taxed to service the massive debts accrued during the recruitment and mobilization phases. By establishing a royal justiciar and a permanent administrative court in Dublin, Henry II provided the legal infrastructure necessary to enforce the bipartite indentures that had previously been vulnerable to local Gaelic disruption. The financiers' gamble had paid off. Their loans were no longer secured by the personal success of an earl, but by the institutional permanence of the Lordship of Ireland. This phase finalized the transition of the Irish Sea into a regulated commercial corridor where the king's servants of the chamber could operate with the full weight of royal law. The submission of the kings thus functioned as the definitive closing of the invasion's initial public offering, replacing high-risk military contracts with a stable, long-term fiscal machine designed for continuous resource extraction. The institutionalization of the Anglo-Norman lordship in Ireland necessitated a transition from private portable debt records to a state-managed infrastructure of fiscal oversight. By 1172, following the royal stabilization of Dublin and Waterford, the Crown mandated the implementation of the Arca system, a network of supervised repositories designed to centralize the legal documentation of all credit operations. These were massive iron-bound chests established in designated urban centers, functioning as the definitive physical archive of the realm's indebtedness. The primary function of the Arca was to eliminate the volatility of decentralized lending by ensuring that every bipartite indenture was recorded under a protocol of redundant security. Each chest was secured by multiple locks, with separate keys distributed among royal officials, Christian burgesses, and Jewish financiers. This tripartite custodianship was an administrative safeguard against unilateral fraud, record tampering, or the physical destruction of counterfoils. For the royal administration, the Arca provided total fiscal transparency. The king's officials could conduct periodic audits of the chests to accurately gauge the community's total assessable assets. This transparency allowed the Exchequer to calculate the next arbitrary tax extraction, known as a tallage, with clinical precision. In the newly organized Irish frontier, the presence of the Arca signaled that the credit economy was no longer an ad hoc mercenary arrangement, but a seamlessly integrated operation within the machinery of the state treasury. Every financial agreement between the Norman gentry and the Jewish financiers was now a matter of public record, guaranteed by the Crown and accessible to the justiciar's oversight. This mandatory centralization turned the Irish juries into controlled zones where financial credit was created, recorded, and audited, ensuring that the king could instantly claim any outstanding debt as a royal asset in the event of default or death. Following the administrative stabilization of Dublin, the physical urban landscape underwent a structural transformation necessitated by the specialized logistical requirements of the financial cohort. While the general Norse Gaelic and early English populace utilized timber, wattle, and thatch, these materials were fundamentally unsuitable for the security of high-density liquid wealth. The introduction of the domus lapidei, or stone house, represented the implementation of defensive architectural technology within the urban core. These structures functioned as fortified economic installations rather than mere residential units. The architectural design prioritized fire resistance and structural integrity, utilizing dressed stone and lime mortar to create resilient vaults and strong rooms. These interior chambers served as the primary storage facilities for unminted silver bullion, precious metal collateral, and the private ledgers of the financiers. The domus lapidei provided a critical, localized layer of protection that complemented the broader security of the royal castle and the city walls. In a volatile urban environment characterized by frequent civil unrest and the recurring threat of arson, stone construction offered a passive defense mechanism, that ensured the physical safety of the Crown's fiscal reservoir. Furthermore, the establishment of these permanent stone buildings signaled a transition from the nomadic logistics of the 1169 vanguard to a settled, institutionalized presence. The geographic concentration of these houses within the Dublin Jewry created a distinct, fortified topography that functioned as the city's private financial district. By investing in permanent stone infrastructure, the financiers anchored the credit economy in the physical bedrock of the city, ensuring that the liquid assets required for the continued expansion of the lordship were shielded from both environmental hazards and localized violence. This architectural shift codified the community's role as the definitive keepers of the realm's mobile capital, transforming the urban fabric into a secure repository for the Angevin state. The consolidation of the Anglo-Norman state in Ireland was as much an administrative achievement as a military one, driven by a specialized class of legal scholars and multilingual facilitators. While the Norman gentry possessed the hardware of conquest, they often lacked the sophisticated literacy required to manage a burgeoning trans-channel bureaucracy. The Jewish community provided this intellectual capital, utilizing a mastery of French, the vernacular of the Angevin elite, and Hebrew to bridge communication gaps between occupying forces and the royal treasury. These scholars acted as indispensable intermediaries, translating the fluid outcomes of territorial acquisition into the codified records required by the Dublin Exchequer. A vital component of this infrastructure was the Beth Din, or House of Judgment, a tribunal of learned men empowered to issue binding legal rulings on commercial and familial disputes. Operating independently of the King's Bench, this judicial body managed the nuances of contract law, ensuring the community remained a stable, self-governing fiscal entity. Furthermore, the intellectual output of these centers included the crafting of responsa, detailed written answers addressing the ethical challenges of maintaining social cohesion within a high-stakes colonial environment. Their proficiency in advanced mathematics and astronomical calculations provided necessary data adopted for accurate timekeeping and resource management within the new state offices. This rigorous system of theological and legal study, rooted in urban yeshivot, produced a supply of specialists capable of navigating both Hebraic jurisprudence and Norman feudal protocols. By providing these specialized linguistic and judicial services, the community institutionalized itself within the administrative fabric of the lordship, transforming from secondary financiers into primary facilitators of the Angevin legal machine. This intellectual vigor provided the stable foundation of cultural identity and legal coherence necessary to survive external political shifts. The mid-1170s signaled a strategic pivot in the financial management of the lordship, as the creditor class identified the expansive grazing lands of the Irish interior as a high-margin export opportunity. While the initial military phase focused on territorial acquisition, the subsequent economic phase necessitated the transformation of a subsistence-based pastoral economy into a standardized commodity system oriented toward international markets. The primary obstacle was the liquidity gap within the newly established manorial and monastic estates, which lacked the silver required to purchase large-scale flocks or hire specialized labor. To resolve this, Jewish financiers began advancing capital specifically for the development of sheep farming, utilizing the forward contract as their primary financial instrument. These legal agreements allowed for the immediate payment of silver in exchange for the future clip of the wool harvest over several years, effectively monetizing the biological growth of the flocks before the wool was even shorn. This infusion of specie enabled the Cistercian monasteries and Norman lords to implement the large-scale grazing techniques already prevalent in England. This capital injection transformed localized Irish markets into integrated nodes of the international textile trade, linking the Irish interior directly to the massive demand of the Flemish and Italian weaving centers. The financiers functioned as the essential bridge between the rural production of the lordship and the urban consumption of the European continent, providing the logistical and credit infrastructure necessary for long-distance export. By underwriting the wool trade, The creditors ensured that the Lordship of Ireland became a self-sustaining fiscal entity capable of generating a continuous export surplus. This secondary phase of investment diversified the financiers' portfolios beyond military debt, securing their role as the primary facilitators of the Anglo-Irish commercial revolution and ensuring the permanent integration of the island into the Atlantic mercantile economy. By the late 1170s, the initial euphoria of territorial conquest was replaced by the grinding reality of institutionalized debt. The Norman gentry, despite their newly acquired Irish manors, found themselves in a state of perpetual fiscal bondage. The primary drivers of this insolvency were the astronomical costs of maintaining permanent military retinues in a hostile frontier and the frequent necessity of paying silver ransoms to Gaelic chieftains. In the high-friction environment of the Irish interior, a captured knight was an immediate liability. His family or lord had to procure hundreds of pounds in liquid bullion to secure his release, often requiring emergency advances from the Jewish community in Dublin or Bristol. Unlike traditional feudal services, which were limited by time, these credit-based obligations accrued compound interest, creating a mathematical trap that the agrarian output of a half-settled manor could rarely outpace. This structural indebtedness generated a profound political shift among the Norman elite, who began to view their creditors not as essential facilitators, but as fiscal predators. The resentment was exacerbated by the fact that the creditors enjoyed the immediate protection of the king's chamber, effectively placing them above the reach of the very lords they financed. This jealous hostility was further fueled by the contrast between the knight's physical risk in the field and the financier's legal security in the urban strongrooms. The Norman gentry began to conceptualize the debt not as a commercial agreement, but as an existential threat to their lineage. By 1180, the debt records within the repositories were increasingly seen by the baronage as shackles of parchment. This climate of economic desperation provided the fertile ground for organized efforts to limit the legal rights of the financiers, as the debtor class sought to use political agitation to cancel what they could not repay. The ideological consolidation of the lordship in the late 1170s was driven by the systematic arrival of reformed monastic orders, primarily the Cistercians and Augustinians, who functioned as the cultural vanguard of the Anglo-Norman state. These orders did not merely establish agricultural estates, they imported a rigid, exclusionary Catholicism that viewed the existing social order through a strictly binary theological lens. This period saw the implementation of the decrees of the Third Lateran Council of 1179, which aimed to enforce a total social and physical segregation between the Christian populace and non-Christian minorities. While earlier phases of the invasion prioritized economic utility, the new ecclesiastical leadership began to disseminate narratives that framed religious difference as a form of spiritual pollution and an existential threat to the purity of the Ecclesia Anglicana in Ireland. This transition was facilitated by the professionalization of the clergy, who used the pulpit to replace localized Gaelic tolerance with standardized European anti-Judaic tropes. The narrative shift was not accidental but served a specific administrative purpose. It delegitimized the legal status of the king's servants of the chamber by characterizing their financial activities as a moral assault on the Christian community. For the first time, the Jewish presence in Dublin and Wexford was analyzed not by the Exchequer's metrics of bullion, but by the Church's metrics of heresy. This religious friction was institutionalized through the production of hagiographies and sermons that emphasized the otherness of the financier class, effectively preparing the public for the confiscatory policies that would follow. The arrival of the Reformed orders thus provided the moral framework for economic disenfranchisement, linking the physical expansion of the monastery to the conceptual contraction of the jury's legal protections. By 1180, the theological boundary had become as formidable as the stone walls of the city, rendering the creditor's position increasingly precarious within a society that now viewed their existence as a spiritual anomaly. The myth of ritual murder or blood libel, arrived in Ireland as a direct cultural import of the Anglo-Norman administration, providing a specific psychological mechanism for debt repudiation. First institutionalized in England following the 1144 death of William of Norwich, the accusation was formalized by the hagiographer Thomas of Monmouth, who constructed a narrative framework that transformed localized tragedies into evidence of a transnational religious conspiracy. By the time the lordship was established in Dublin, this narrative had become a standard rhetorical tool for the heavily indebted Norman gentry. The myth posited that the Jewish community engaged in the ritualistic murder of Christian children, a charge that served to classify the financier class as an existential threat to the biological survival of the Christian state. In the Irish context, these accusations were rarely spontaneous. They were strategically deployed during periods of peak fiscal pressure. When the principal and interest on a bipartite indenture reached a level that threatened the solvency of a Norman manor, the blood libel provided a religiously sanctioned justification for the physical seizure of the Arca and the destruction of debt records. This was the weaponization of folklore for the purpose of asset liquidation. By framing the creditor as a ritual predator, the debtor class could bypass the king's legal protections under the guise of holy vengeance. This cultural migration ensured that the Jewish community in Dublin and Wexford lived in a state of perpetual legal vulnerability, where their property was hostage to the volatile intersection of ecclesiastical myth and aristocratic insolvency. The libel functioned as the ultimate force majeure clause, allowing the gentry to periodically attempt a reset of the financial ledger through the incitement of urban violence, marking the definitive end of the era of mutual cooperation. The administrative evolution of the lordship reached its institutional peak with the establishment of a specialized branch of the Dublin Treasury, the Exchequer of the Jews. This was not a general tax office, but a dedicated bureaucratic department staffed by justices of the Jews, whose sole mandate was to monitor and extract the liquid wealth of the creditor class. By the 1180s, the Crown realized that the informal extractions of the early invasion were insufficient for a maturing state. It required a systematic mechanism to ensure that every fluctuation in Jewish capital was instantly transparent to the royal justiciar. The Exchequer functioned as a high-velocity revenue conduit, transforming private interest into sovereign income through a process known as escheat. Under this protocol, when a financier died, his entire portfolio of outstanding loans did not simply pass to his heirs. Instead, the Crown claimed a mandatory portion, often a third or more, while the king himself stepped into the legal shoes of the creditor to collect the remaining debts. This effectively turned the royal government into the largest debt collection agency in Ireland. The department maintained rigorous pipe rolls, meticulous parchment records of every fine, tallage, and legal fee processed through the office. This bureaucratic oversight ensured that the Jewish community functioned as a permanent, self-replenishing fiscal reservoir. Unlike the feudal subsidies that required negotiation with the troublesome Norman barons, the revenue from this exchequer was a matter of royal prerogative, accessible at will to fund the ongoing military fortification of the Pale. By centralizing this department in Dublin, the Angevin state successfully nationalized the private credit industry, ensuring that the profit from every Irish loan ultimately flowed into the royal coffers to sustain the structural costs of the empire. By the final decade of the 12th century, the Angevin monarchy's relationship with its financial agents transitioned from a symbiotic protectionism to a regime of systematic predatory extraction. The Crown increasingly utilized the tallage, an arbitrary and non-negotiable levy, as its primary tool for liquidating the community's accumulated capital. Under the reign of King John, this policy escalated into a statewide operation of mass incarceration designed to coerce the payment of impossible sums. In 1210, the Tallage of Bristol saw the synchronized arrest of every Jewish financier in the lordship and England, with their physical persons held as collateral in royal dungeons. This was a tactical shift from taxing interest to confiscating principal. To enforce these demands, Royal officials employed physical torture, most notably the extraction of teeth, to break the resistance of wealthy individuals who claimed insolvency. Those unable to meet the specific silver quotas faced the permanent forfeiture of their entire estates, including the physical bipartite indentures that represented their outstanding loans. By seizing these parchments, the crown effectively nationalized the debts of the Norman gentry, allowing the king to collect the full value of the loans directly. This process turned the Jewish community into a consumable resource for a monarchy desperate to fund the defense of Normandy and the costs of the papal interdict. The systematic nature of this extortion was recorded in the Fine Rolls, which detailed the transition of private wealth into the royal chamber under the threat of lifelong imprisonment. This era of fiscal terror decimated the liquidity of the Dublin and Bristol juries, as the Crown prioritized immediate cash flow over the long-term stability of the credit market. The resulting capital flight and poverty signaled the terminal decline of the independent financier class, as they were reduced from sophisticated administrative facilitators to exhausted subjects of royal plunder. The stabilization of the Lordship of Ireland reached its material zenith through the monumental transition from temporary timber fortifications to a permanent stone-based landscape. This structural evolution was facilitated by the deep integration of the credit economy into the very fabric of the developing state. The construction of massive masonry keeps, such as those at Trim and Carrickfergus, represented a massive consolidation of fixed capital that required the coordination of specialized labor guilds, including master masons and lime burners. These professionals operated outside the traditional feudal labor obligations and demanded direct payment in silver coin, a liquidity that only the established financial networks could provide. Simultaneously, the burgeoning urban centers saw the rise of the great Gothic cathedrals, which served as both spiritual monuments and administrative anchors for the new religious orders. The financing of these cathedrals, characterized by the importation of con stone and specialized glazing, mirrored the sophistication of the earlier military indentures. These architectural projects were funded by long-term advances secured against the predictable revenues of market tolls and burgage rents. This system effectively monetized the future commercial growth of the towns to pay for the immediate physical infrastructure of the state. By 1220, the Irish landscape was defined by this stone revolution, where every castle and cathedral functioned as a physical manifestation of the ongoing relationship between the Norman administration and its financiers. The credit system had evolved from a tool of conquest into the permanent scaffolding of the medieval economy, ensuring that the wealth of the interior was perpetually channeled into the monumental symbols of Angevin authority. This physical legacy transformed the Irish Sea region into a standardized province of the European Gothic world, underpinned by the same fiscal machinery that had once fueled the first Norman landing. The 1175 Treaty of Windsor functioned as the constitutional settlement that concluded the era of speculative military expansion and institutionalized the Lordship of Ireland. This diplomatic instrument established a legal binary. Ruaidhri Ua Conchobair was recognized as King of Connaught and High King of the unconquered Gaelic regions, provided he collected and transmitted an annual tribute of 1 hide for every 10 cattle to the royal Exchequer. This formalization of tribute into taxation integrated the Gaelic interior into the Angevin fiscal network without the requirement for total territorial occupation. For the financiers, the treaty represented the final conversion of high-risk war credit into a state-regulated revenue system. Their role shifted from funding vanguard knights to managing the complex cross-channel remittances generated by these new treaty obligations. The community became a specialized economic instrument, a fiscal valve through which the king could extract value from both Norman tenants and Gaelic sub-kings. However, this integration created a dangerous interdependency. The legal survival of the Jewish cohort was now inextricably linked to the volatile solvency of the royal household. As the costs of defending the lordship against internal rebellion and continental challenges mounted, the king treated the community's assets as a floating debt facility. The Treaty of Windsor essentially closed the frontier, transforming Ireland into an audited province where every transaction was monitored by the Dublin justiciar. By 1175, the conquest was no longer a matter of privateer initiative, but a standardized department of the state. The financial community, having provided the initial seed capital for the ironclad invasion, was now a permanent fixture of the administrative landscape, serving as the ultimate guarantor of the crown's liquidity in a land where the transition from cattle wealth to silver wealth was now a matter of international law. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.